As you settle in for a moment of peace and relaxation, I invite you to share in the comments where you are in the world and what time of day it is for you. I always love seeing how far our community of night owls stretches. If you enjoy losing yourself in the rich tapestry of history to relax, think about subscribing for more calming stories like this one, which shows a rustic table set with a simple meal, a bowl of thin, bland porridge, a chunk of dense, coarse bread, and maybe a few when kings and nobles feasted on sumptuous multi-course banquets. The average peasant lived on a diet that was both meager and monotonous. What factors combined to make food in the Middle Ages so unappetizing for the masses? Let's examine this question and travel back in time to a time when filling one's belly was a daily struggle in a medieval peasant's home, where the aroma of exotic spices was noticeably absent. Morsels of tough, stringy meat, if the diner is lucky. Imagine the life of a spice trader in the 11th century, navigating the perilous Silk Road to bring a taste of opulence to European shores. The prohibitive expense of spices meant that the common folk had to make do with the pungent notes of garlic, mustard, and vinegar to enliven their plain fare. Cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg pepper were luxuries reserved for the wealthy, brought from distant lands by intrepid merchants in those times. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal treats at best, and the lucky few with access to a plot of land might grow some hardy crops like onions, cabbages, and rye and barley, but these were hardly enough to balance out a diet heavily reliant on grains. The majority of meals were made up of breads and porridges made from barley, rye, and wheat, occasionally supplemented with legumes like peas and beans. Lack of vital nutrients caused widespread malnutrition and stunted growth. Although meat was valued, it was uncommon on peasant tables. A wealthy family might own a cow, pig, or chicken, but these animals were valuable resources that should not be slaughtered carelessly. Instead, meat was saved for special occasions like weddings and religious feasts, or when an animal was too old or ill to be used for any other purpose. Fish was more accessible than meat for those who lived near rivers or the sea, but it was also frequently preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to last through lean times. The end result was a far cry from the delicate flaky filelats we enjoy today. Organ meats were common among peasants, as were small birds and game caught by trapping or hunting. Though poaching in the royal forests was a risky endeavor, punishable by severe penalties, the lack of fresh food forced medieval cooks to use inventive preservation techniques such as pickling, fermentation, and drying. To prolong the shelf life of perishables, cabbage would be shredded and fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions pickled in vinegar, and fruits. Freshwater fish, such as carp and pike, were a delicacy reserved for the nobility who kept private fish ponds on their estates. Even staples like bread and ale, which were the cornerstones of medieval sustenance, were not always reliable, untrustworthy. Bakers might stretch their dough with fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust, resulting in loaves that were as hard as rocks and about as nutritious. Ale was also frequently watered down to increase profits, a practice that earned some alewives a nasty reputation in an era when clean drinking was the norm. Examples of preserved foods that were used to add variety to the peasant diet included apples and pears that were dried for winter storage. Water was scarce, so weak ale was frequently the only safe option because the brewing process helped to kill off harmful bacteria. This leads us to what may be the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining: the complete lack of hygiene, ignorance of germs, and widespread food safety contamination. Livestock were frequently kept near living quarters for warmth and protection, and their waste seeped into the areas where food was prepared and consumed. In crowded cities, human waste and garbage filled the streets, contaminating water sources and drawing rodents. It is therefore not surprising that food was the spectre of disease was always present at the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which killed a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread partly because of unhygienic conditions that allowed rats and fleas to flourish, and food markets were notorious for being breeding grounds for pestilence. Even royalty was not immune to the dangers of spoiled fair kings. For instance, it is said that King John of England died after overindulging in peaches and new cider, a feast that probably resulted in a fatal case of dysentery. Monasteries and abbeys were frequently seen as havens of relative plenty, with well-kept gardens and orchards offering a bounty of fresh produce. Monks were renowned for their culinary skills, with some even writing cookbooks that offered a glimpse into the more refined cuisine of the upper echelons. Yet, despite the dangers of medieval dining, which included flies buzzing around meat stalls and rodents scuttling underfoot, there were glimmers of gastronomic hope. A royal banquet might include dozens of dishes, ranging from roast swan and peacock to delicate pasties and sweetmeats. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttonous revelry. However, even these extravagant spreads were not without their risks, as spoiled meats and rancid sauces took their toll on noble stomachs, and the sheer volume of food was a common cause of food poisoning. As we consider the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's difficult not to feel thankful for the abundance and variety that we enjoy today. Our supermarkets are filled with fresh produce from around the world. Our meats are safe and sanitized, and our spice racks hold flavors that would have made any medieval monarch proud. But even as we enjoy the fruits of modernity, our consumption could result in painful digestive issues and serve as a reminder that even the wealthy were not immune to the dangers of medieval dining. The next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you savor the flavors and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of. Raise a glass to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point. If you find yourself complaining about a dish that isn't perfect, spare a thought. We can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors who made do with so little and found ways to survive in the face of unrelenting hardship. So, dear listener, I wish you a good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity but a blessing. As we allow our thoughts to wander back to that far-off past, let us find solace in the knowledge that we are the fortunate inheritors of centuries of culinary progress. Let us not forget the lessons that history has to teach us about perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of times. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink in the dark streets of a medieval city. A baker stealthily looks to his left and right before retreating back into his shop. He takes out a sack of sawdust and starts kneading it into the dough, stretching his paltry supply of flour. May your own culinary journey be full of flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all that we have been given. Until the next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. Bread was the mainstay of the medieval diet, but its purity was frequently weakened by dishonest bakers who added fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust to lengthen their dough. The result was a coarse, gritty loaf that provided little nutrition. The very thing that kept peasants going through their arduous labor had become yet another hardship to endure, and wine had also succumbed to the time's desperation. One such alewife, Elizabeth, works over her bubbling cauldron, stirring in yet another bucket of cloudy water. Her children hover near their hungry eyes, watching each drip, knowing that their next meal depends on this batch. As she ladles out a mug of the watered-down brew, she sighs, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale her grandmother used to make. Alewives and innkeepers who were struggling to make a profit would water down their brew to stretch it further, resulting in a thin, sour swill that bore little resemblance to the hearty ale that was the pride of the British Isles. Once created as a family recipe, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate necessity during a time when clean drinking water was scarce. Wells and rivers were frequently contaminated by human and animal waste, making them rife with disease. The alcohol in these drinks, despite being diluted, was still potent enough to kill some of the harmful bacteria, forcing peasants to choose between the empty calories of watered-down ale and the risk of contracting a disease from tainted water. Stop these dishonest practices. A 13th century law imposed stringent restrictions on the cost, weight, and quality of bread and ale. Violators faced heavy fines or even imprisonment, but due to the lack of enforcement resources and the poverty of the poor, these laws had little effect on the spread of food adulteration. As a result, the medieval peasantry had to constantly make concessions, juggling the bitter disappointment of contaminated food with the numbing pain of hunger. Every mouthful served as a reminder of their precarious existence, where even in our next chapter, we'll examine how the very spaces in which they lived contributed to the difficulties they faced in obtaining a decent meal. The close quarters shared by man and beast and the lack of sanitation that plagued medieval cities made the simple act of eating a perilous proposition. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, we must keep in mind that these were not just historical facts, but the everyday struggles of real people. Picture, if you will, a small thatched cottage huddled against the chill of a medieval winter inside a family huddled around a meager fire, their breath mingling with the steam rising from a bubbling pot of pottage in the corner, a pig rooting through the rushes covering the dirt floor, snorting and grunting, a constant backdrop to the family's daily life. This was the reality for many medieval peasants, who lived in cramped quarters with their livestock, their dung and debris mingling with the straw and rushes that served as the only floor. The story of King John of England is a dramatic example. In 1216, while travelling across the country, the king became ill after eating a surplus of peaches. Historians now believe that these peaches were likely spoiled, which led to a case of dysentery that ultimately claimed the king's life in the crowded castle. Covering it was a breeding ground for disease, with fleas and lice thriving in the unsanitary conditions. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was a challenge without a proper understanding of hygiene. The situation in medieval European cities was even worse, with narrow streets clogged with trash and human waste contaminating the air and leaking into the water supply. In London, the Thames River served as a drinking water source as well as a landfill for the city's waste, so it's no wonder that disease was common, with outbreaks of typhoid, descent, and even the dreaded Black Death, the deadly disease that ravaged Europe in the 14th century was partly caused by there was little way for the average peasant to escape the filthy conditions of medieval cities, where fleas carried by rats that thrived in the filth became the unwitting harbingers of the plague, spreading the disease from person to person with terrifying efficiency. They lived and died in the midst of the filth, their bodies weary from constant exposure to disease and malnutrition. Even the act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment. As we think about these facts, it's easy to feel hopeless for the suffering of the medieval peasant, but there were also bright spots, such as the generosity of neighbors sharing what little they had and the comfort that came from faith and community. In our next chapter, we'll examine how the church, despite its own part in the hardships of the time, also provided some relief and hope to the hungry and the downtrodden. Part 6 will examine the influence of in a world where so much was uncertain. The church stood as a bastion of stability and authority. However, this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which were related to food. For example, the Catholic Church required frequent fasting and meatless days for 40 days before Easter, and the tolling of church bells marked the rhythm of life in medieval Europe for peasants working in the fields. These peals also signaled a reprieve from the relentless demands of their work and their hunger. The story of one peasant family demonstrates the hardship that these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret worked from sunrise to sunset on their small plot of land, barely growing enough to feed their 3 children. When Lent arrived, they faced the difficult decision of either honoring the fast and risk weakening their already malnourished bodies, or defying the church and facing the consequences for their actions. The faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, which was a tall order for those who were already struggling to put food on the table. Despite the additional hardships these fasts imposed, the church was not completely blind to the plight of the poor monasteries, and abbeys frequently served as a source of food aid, distributing bread and alms to the needy as a form of relief. Ultimately, immortal souls decided to follow the fast, subsisting on meager portions of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were gaunt and their steps were heavy with exhaustion, but they found comfort in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. The need for aid frequently exceeded the church's capacity to supply it, and for those caught poaching in the royal forest's a last-ditch effort to augment their meager diets with fresh game, the church's mercy was conspicuously lacking. Monks, with their vast lands and resources, were able to provide some relief to the hungry masses, but even this charity had its limits when crops failed and famine struck. Poachers who were caught faced harsh punishments, ranging from maiming to death. As we look to the last chapter of our journey through medieval food, we will see a scene of shocking contrast, the lavish feast of a noble household against the backdrop of poverty. The church's influence on medieval food was a double-edged sword, providing relief and assistance to some while placing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and a further trial to endure in the face of unrelenting hunger. Part 7. The rare medieval feast, the great hall of the castle, is alive with the flicker of 100 candles. Tapestries line the walls, their vibrant threads telling stories of heroic deeds and courtly love. At the head of the room, on a raised dais, the lord and lady preside over a scene of opulence and plenty. These lavish displays serve as a stark reminder of the vast inequalities that defined the era. The air is thick with the scent of saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices so precious they're worth their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the master cook creates a symphony of culinary creation, barking orders at his guests. The table is groaning under the weight of innumerable dishes, including whole roasted pigs, their skins crackling and golden, as they compete for space with elegant silver platters of delicately spiced peacocks. As the feast goes on, the diners gorge themselves on an apparently endless parade of dishes, tearing into the tender flesh of roast venison sap on creamy almond soup and sugar sculptures, crafted into fantastical shapes of castles and unicorns. The cook uses these intricate details to solidify his reputation and secure his place in his lord's favor, while the underlings rush to baste the meats, stir the pots, and plate the intricate subtleties. Even in the midst of this revelry, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval life. A noblewoman, her face flushed with wine, suddenly pales and excuses herself from the table, her stomach churning from the richness of the food, and a night when his teeth are rotting from eating shredded chicken mixed with rice, milk, and sugar. As the last plates are cleared and the last crumbs are swept away, we are left to consider the stark contrasts. The serving staff hovers at the edges of the hall, watching the excesses of their betters with a mixture of envy and resentment. They know that tomorrow they will return to their usual fare of coarse bread and thin GRL. The memory of this feast is a taunting reminder of the gulf between their world and that of their masters. It's easy to forget the struggles our medieval ancestors faced, but by comprehending their struggles, we can better appreciate the comforts we enjoy today. For the nobility, feasts were a show of wealth, status, and power, an opportunity to indulge in the best foods the land had to offer. However, for the vast majority, food was a daily struggle, a constant battle against scarcity, adulteration, and disease. As we end this exploration of medieval cuisine, let us do so with a sense of gratitude and perspective, because, in the vast tapestry of human history, our own time is but a brief and privileged chapter woven from the threads of countless lives lived and meals shared, each one a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Let us take a moment to appreciate not only the flavors on our tongues, but also the hard-won progress that allows us to eat with such ease and variety. Conclusion: as we have explored the world of medieval cuisine, we have seen a world of poverty, hardship, and inequality. From the boring monotony of peasant pottage to the harmful fillers in contaminated bread, the difficulties of sustaining oneself during the Middle Ages were relentless. We have seen how the lack of variety in spices, preservation issues, imbalanced diets, and unhygienic conditions all worked together to make medieval cuisine very different from the feasts we enjoy today. We have also seen the effects of the Church's fasting edicts, which added spiritual burdens. In our modern world, it's easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South Africa, and we've marveled at the lavish feasts of the nobility, which provide a glittering contrast to the grim realities faced by most. However, throughout it all, we've also seen glimpses of humanity's unbreakable spirit, the creativity of cooks making the most of limited ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing what little they had, and the comfort found in the rituals of faith and feast. If we were to transport a medieval peasant into the aisles of a modern grocery store, the sheer variety would be overwhelming. The produce section's vibrant colors, the gleaming refrigerated cases filled with milk and eggs, the shelves upon shelves of prepackaged meals and snacks, it would be like entering a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. America's spices from Asia and European cheeses are all neatly packaged and ready to eat, and we can eat at restaurants serving cuisines from around the world, or have a world of flavors delivered right to our doorstep. In our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We struggle with the health effects of overindulgence, the environmental impact of our food systems, issues of access and inequality, and the value of simplicity in seasonal eating and local flavors. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors, but even as we recognize how far we've come, we can embrace the joy of feeding loved ones and the satisfaction of a dish prepared with care. Creativity. We can remember the importance of protecting and appreciating the earth's abundance instead of taking it for granted. And most importantly, we can approach our own meals with awe and gratitude, realizing the amazing journey that food has taken to get to our plates, from the sun-drenched fields to the busy kitchens to the comfort of our own tables, each bite of which is a testament to the human spirit's tenacity and inventiveness throughout the ages. As the royal cook bustled about the castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast that most of his fellow countrymen could only dream of such opulence for the serf toiling in the fields, let's raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup, to the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation for the world we live in today. By honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where everyone may eat with joy, dignity, and plenty. A peasant's life in medieval times was one of constant hardship, and nowhere was this more evident than in their daily sustenance. While the nobles dined on exotic dishes flavored with expensive spices from distant lands, the meal was a simple affair of coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew of whatever vegetables or scraps could be found. On a good day, there might be a bit of salted pork or dried fish to add some flavor to the GRL-like mix, but more often than not, it was a bland and unsatisfying fare that left the stomach half full. Even the wealthy were vulnerable to the dangers of medieval cuisine, as the extravagant feasts that characterized aristocratic life frequently came with a hidden cost. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat, and many nobles became ill or even died from eating tainted food. The very feasts that were supposed to demonstrate their wealth and status could prove to be their downfall. As was the case with King John of England, whose untimely death in 1216 was attributed to a surfeit of peaches. According to the legend, the king was passing through the town of King's Lynn when he became enmeshed in a terrible case of descent. Some claimed that this was caused by the rich food he had eaten at a nearby abbey, while others attribute it to the peaches he had happily consumed. Whatever the reason, the king's condition rapidly deteriorated, and he passed away a few days later. The fact that even the most affluent and powerful people were vulnerable to the dangers that lurked in their food is a testament to the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages. The temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too strong to resist in a world where hunger was a constant companion. This was particularly true during lean years when crops failed and food was scarce. People would eat anything they could find, even if it meant risking their health or even their lives. For example, acorns, grass, and other wild plants were frequently ground into a coarse flour to make bread, and animals that had died of disease were occasionally eaten out of. The Alu wife, who sold her ale in the village tavern, was a common figure in medieval life and one who frequently bore the brunt of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was frequently adulterated in ways that would be unimaginable today. For example, dishonest bakers would stretch their dough with fillers like sawdust or chalk, and brewers would water down their ale to increase their profits. These practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous because they could cause serious illness or even death. Despite the many difficulties and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of respite and comfort. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with noxious substances, or even of practicing witchcraft. Even in the monasteries and abbeys that dot the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders would be further restricted for 40 long days, during which they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. In addition, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline for the monks and nuns, who devoted their lives to prayer and service. In a world where food was so scarce and unpredictable, the idea of willingly giving it up must have seemed like the height of insanity. However, despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food by salting, smoking, and drying to make the most of the meager ingredients. For some, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a tale of tenacity and resourcefulness in the face of hardship. It serves as a reminder of how far we have come in terms of food, safety, variety, and abundance. But it also highlights how much we still have in common with our ancestors, because, just as they struggled to provide for their families and put food on the table, so do we now face issues like climate change, food insecurity, and the demands of modern life. It is easy to forget the struggles and sacrifices that have led us to this point in modern life as we sit down to our own meals that are loaded with an overwhelming variety of flavors and ingredients from all over the world. However, by learning about the history of our food and how it has shaped our culture and identity, we can better appreciate the abundance and diversity that we enjoy today. So, the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to think about the lengthy, and perhaps, if a medieval peasant was somehow transported to a modern grocery store, they would be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might be in awe of the exotic fruits and vegetables from far-off lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of food produced by the innumerable generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who have worked to put food on our tables and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest of challenges. The medieval peasant may simply shake their head in awe and go back to their own time, content with packaged and processed foods, but they may also feel uneasy or even distrustful, wondering at the hidden costs and compromises that have made such abundance possible. They may also question the methods used to grow and raise our food, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. The straightforward fare that has supported them for generations, because although our contemporary food system may provide us with more options and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own difficulties and disadvantages. Just as the medieval peasantry had to learn to survive on what they had in the face of adversity and scarcity, so too must we learn to understand the complexities of our own food landscape and make decisions that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us and leave a legacy of health and plenty for future generations. As we have seen, the medieval spice trade was a profitable but dangerous industry, and those who controlled the flow of spices could amass great fortunes. Let us celebrate the flavors and textures of the foods we eat, not only as a source of sustenance, but also as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. Let us never forget the power of food to bring us together, to nourish our bodies and our spirits, and to remind us of our shared humanity in the face of even the greatest challenges. One of these spice merchants, Giovanni de Marinoli, was born into a noble Florentine family in the early 14th century. Although he appeared destined for a life of ease and comfort, his restless spirit and thirst for adventure led him down a different path. In 1338, Giovanni embarked on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the busy ports of Italy to the far-off lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, Giovanni's official mission was to spread Christianity, but he was also a savvy businessman who was constantly searching for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's travels were dangerous at every turn, as he braved bandits and sandstorms while traversing the vast deserts of Central Asia, navigating treacherous mountain passes in the Himalayas, battling frostbite and altitude sickness, and sailing the storm-tossed Indian Ocean, praying to survive each monsoon season. Endured, Giovanni was also mesmerized by the wonders he saw. He marveled at the shining white palaces of Kombolek, the Mongol capital that would later become Beijing. He marveled at the religious devotion of the Thomas Christians in southern India. He reveled in the strong flavors and scents of the spice markets in Sun and Malabar. Giovanni collected a rich cargo of nutmeg and cinnamon pepper cloves, which were carefully packed in chests to keep them dry during the long journey home. Bring these spices safely back to Italy, he stood to make a fortune. However, according to some stories, his ship was lost at sea on the return trip, carrying him and his valuable spices all the way to the briny deep. Other stories claim that he survived the journey, only to have his spices scattered to the wind and be robbed and killed by brigands on the outskirts of Florence. Regardless of the truth, Giovanni de Marinoli's story serves as a reminder of the amazing risks and rewards of the medieval spice trade for a select few wealthy people. Spices could be a ticket to untold riches for merchants and lucky adventurers. But for most people, like Giovanni, they remained a tantalizing dream that was always just out of reach as we fell asleep. Let's picture ourselves in a busy spice market in a remote part of the medieval world, where the air is heavy with the aroma of pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, and saffron. The merchants' voices rise and fall like the tide as we wander the narrow lanes with baskets in hand, amazed by the vibrant piles of spices from as we fill our baskets. We can't help but feel a twinge of regret for the many who will never experience these flavors. For the impoverished peasants back home, even a pinch of pepper would be an unimaginable luxury, let alone a fragrant curry or a spiced wine. Their food, as we'll discover further, is a monotonous grind of girl and grit, a far cry from the sumptuous feasts we've seen. Everywhere in the world, there is a heap of ginger root that is gnarled and pungent, and there are cloves that resemble tiny brown nails. As we drift deeper into our dreams, because when we wake up, we'll have to face the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, which made filling one's belly a daily battle for both princes and paupers. The scarcity and hardship that defined medieval food for the masses extended even to the staples that were served at the tables of the wealthy. But even those lavish banquets, as we'll soon discover, could come with their own hidden dangers and disgusting surprises, served as the foundation of their diets. The most basic and common food they ate was bread, which was often a coarse, unappetizing loaf that would be almost unrecognizable to poorer peasants today. Bread was made from lower quality grains like barley rye, and even beans or chestnuts during times of scarcity, which produced dense, dark loaves that were hard to digest and offered little nutrition. The bread was frequently full of gritty impurities from subpar milling techniques, and it would quickly become stale or moldy, since leaven-venning agents like yeast were costly and scarce. Most bread was unleavened flatbread, similar to modern bread, which would be baked on a hearthstone or dried in the sun to give it a hard, cracker-like consistency. The quality of bread was so crucial that it was frequently used as a marker of social class. In the damp conditions of many peasant homes, even for slightly better-off peasants who could afford wheat bread, the finished product was a far cry from the fluffy leavened loaves we enjoy today. One notable figure in the history of medieval bread production was the mystic Saint Hildegard of Bingen, who was born into a noble family in what is now Germany. The finest loaves made from pure wheat flour were reserved for the nobility, while the greyish-brown loaves of the peasantry were mocked as black bread in some regions. Strict laws even forbade commoners from consuming white bread, making it a privilege of the elite. In addition to her inventive spiritual writings and musical compositions, Hildegard was well known for her understanding of natural medicine and herbalism. She wrote extensively about the qualities of grains and the significance of healthy eating, even at a time when these concepts were not commonly accepted. In her treatise Physica, Hildegard described an ancient grain that was closely related to wheat as the best grain for human consumption, though spelt was still a luxury good that was out of reach for the majority of peasants. Hildegard's promotion of it as a healthier substitute for common wheat was remarkably effective. Hildegard believed that spelt bread nourished the body and enhanced longevity, while warning against the consumption of raw cereals as detrimental to health. Hildegard put her knowledge into practice by overseeing the extensive agricultural lands and bakery of her abbey. Under her guidance, the nuns of Bingen produced high-quality, spelt bread that was given to the sick and impoverished in the surrounding community. Recent advances in nutritional science have supported many of her assertions, demonstrating that wheat is easier for many people to digest and has a higher protein content than highly processed modern wheat. Hildegard of Bingen's life and work offer insight into the vital role that bread played in medieval society, not only as a staple food, but also as a status symbol and possible therapeutic tool. Her teachings were based on a comprehensive understanding of the unequal distribution of this basic necessity was just one more way that the glaring class divides of medieval society manifested in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the meager comfort of a regular supply of bread could be stripped away by the cruel twists of fate and weather in times of drought, flood, or other disasters. This connection between food and health foreshadowed modern ideas about nutrition and wellness despite the efforts of visionaries like Hildegard. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1316 was one of the worst famines to hit medieval Europe. When grain crops failed, the spectre of famine hung over medieval communities. During these dreaded years of dearth, food prices would soar while wages plummeted, leaving many peasants unable to afford even a basic subsistence with no social safety net to rely on. The poorest were left to starve or turn to desperate measures like eating bark grass or even cannibalism. The chronicles of the period paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by the common people during the 7 years of famine and misery that began in 1322, when a catastrophic confluence of factors, including climate change, crop failures, and the economic fallout of endless wars, plunged the continent into. Some men, it was said, were driven by hunger to eat the bodies of executed criminals, while others ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things. Even in the best of times, the threat of hunger was always present for medieval peasants, whose precarious existence at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their lords meant that food insecurity was a constant companion. The famine hit the Low Countries in Scandinavia particularly hard, with mortality rates as high as 10 to 25% in some regions. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of 16 deaths per day compared to just 2 per day in normal times. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we'll see how this pervasive scarcity and insecurity shaped not just the diets, but the entire medieval worldview. The grim reality of famine cast a long shadow over the medieval world, serving as a reminder of the fragility of life in an era before modern agriculture and social welfare. In this world, even the most basic necessity of bread could not be taken for granted, and the specter of starvation lurked, just one poor harvest away. But first, let's look at another mainstay of the medieval diet that was hardly more enticing than the bread of the time. Meat was a rare treat saved for special occasions, and when it did appear on the menu, it frequently came in forms that would turn the stomachs of modern diners in the absence of refrigeration. People in a time when a full belly was a luxury, and a stale crust a treasure took on a significance that is difficult to imagine from our modern vantage point of abundance and choice. In order to prevent meat from spoiling, people had to use a variety of methods. The most popular method was salting, since meats that were heavily salted were a mainstay of winter diets. However, the salt itself was frequently of low quality, and full of impurities that could make the meat taste bad or even cause illness. Other methods of preserving meats included smoking and drying, especially when it came to sausages and hams, which could keep for longer periods of time but eventually became hard and unappetizing, with a texture more like leather than the juicy, tender meats we enjoy today. The type and quantity of meat in medieval diets varied greatly by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people mostly relied on freshwater fish rather than terrestrial meat, and beef was rarely consumed by commoners, because cattle were simply too valuable to slaughter. Pork and poultry were somewhat more common, but were still considered luxury items for the majority. The records of King Richard II's cooks in the late 14th century provide a striking look into the inequality of medieval meat consumption. For a single royal feast in 1387, the kitchens prepared 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 small pigs, all of which were fit for a king, in contrast to what a peasant family might have eaten. Nobility, who fiercely protected their exclusive rights to venison and other game meats in the aftermath of the Black Death, which killed up to half of the population in the middle of the 4th century. The massive labor shortage gave surviving peasants newfound bargaining power, with fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land. However, for a brief moment in medieval England's history, the humble peasantry got a taste of the bounty usually reserved for their betters. Expect to eat meat only a few times a year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the cuts would be meager and have been meticulously saved for months. For a few brief decades, many peasants were in a unique position to demand better living conditions and higher wages. The standard of living for English commoners actually improved, and meat consumption increased as more peasants could afford to keep livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. In some areas, wages even doubled or tripled, allowing working families to add the occasional chicken, pig, or even cow to their usual fare of porridge and bread. However, This golden age for the peasantry was to be short-lived. As the landed nobility became alarmed by the growing influence of the lower classes, fought back with laws that attempted to tie peasants to the land and freeze wages at pre-plague levels, tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would eventually lead to the Peasant Revolt of 1381, which was brutally put down, with its leaders put to death and its gains largely undone. However, for a brief shining moment, the common people of England were given a taste of a life free from hardship and scarcity. But for the majority of the Middle Ages, and for in the great halls of castles and manors, nobles and knights feasted, on heaping platters of roasted game and delicate fowl, washing it down with fine wines and honeyed meat. However, in the hovels of the peasantry, a scrap of salted pork or a stringy chicken leg was a hard-won delicacy to be savoured and stretched as far as it could go. This disparity in access to such a basic food item highlights the harsh inequalities that characterized life in the Middle Ages, in a world where even a full, as we've seen, the rare morsel of meat was a highlight in the otherwise dreary and monotonous diet of most medieval people. However, even this small pleasure was subject to strict regulation by the power of the Church in medieval Europe, where the Catholic Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of daily life, including food. The gap between the rich and the poor was as wide as the distance between a king's banquet table and a peasant's empty trencher. The most important of these were the 40-day period leading up to Easter, known as Lent, when all meat, dairy, and eggs were prohibited. This left the faithful to survive on a meager diet of fish, vegetables, and bread. For wealthy nobles, this was a minor inconvenience because they could afford to import exotic fruits, nuts, and spices to liven up their Lenten fare. And their well-stocked fish ponds ensured a steady supply of fresh food. Seafood, but for the impoverished, Lent meant an even more restrictive and boring diet than usual. The Church justified these dietary restrictions by claiming that by denying themselves the pleasures of the flesh, even food, the faithful were purifying their souls and identifying with Christ's suffering. However, in a world where most people experienced hunger and scarcity on a daily basis, the idea of voluntary deprivation must have seemed a bitter pill. Ironically, for peasants who hardly ever ate meat, the added restrictions might have seemed like a cruel joke. But the Church's influence was so strong that few dared to openly disobey its dietary laws, because doing so would have put them at risk of social rejection, as well as the very real threat of eternal damnation at a time when the afterlife was valued more highly than this one. In fact, one moving story that highlights the difficulties of Lenten fasting comes from the records of a 14th century English manor in 1322, a peasant. A woman named Agnes Paston was charged with stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. In her defense, she claimed that she had stolen the bread to feed her starving children, who were too young to comprehend the fast's rules. She pleaded for mercy, arguing that God would not want her helpless infants to go hungry. The court was moved by her plea and took the unusual step of clearing Agnes of the theft charge, but they still chastised her for breaking the Lenten fast, and reminded her that the needs of the soul must come before the body. In a world where food was limited and survival was uncertain, the idea of voluntarily foregoing what little sustenance was available must have been difficult for Agnes and countless others like her to accept. However, the Church's influence on medieval food culture wasn't entirely negative. Monasteries and abbeys were frequently at the forefront of agricultural innovation, pioneering new techniques for crop rotation, irrigation, and selective breeding. They also served as archives of traditional agricultural and food preservation knowledge, preserving the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece. In addition, the church was a major provider of food aid to the hungry and impoverished, with many operating hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick and destitute. In an era before organized charity or social welfare programs, the church was frequently the only safety net accessible to the most vulnerable members of society. Its teachings about as the Middle Ages wore on, the culinary distance between the wealthy and the poor, the virtues of charity and the sin of gluttony helped to create a moral imperative for those with means to share their bounty with the less fortunate. Of course, this charity was often mixed with a heavy dose of paternalism and moral judgment. The poor were expected to accept their lot in life as divinely ordained and be grateful for whatever scraps they were given. But for those who were on the verge of starvation, even a small act of kindness could mean the difference between life and death. At the same time that the Black Death and subsequent waves of plague had decimated the population, causing labor shortages and rising wages, food prices skyrocketed, leaving many commoners unable to afford even basic staples. Meanwhile, Europe was experiencing what some historians have dubbed the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures and frequent climatic disruptions. Crop yields declined as fields were battered by droughts, floods, and unseasonable frosts. The nobility and the burgeoning merchant class responded by doubling down on conspicuous consumption as a means of showcasing their wealth and status. Exotic banquets with lavish displays of sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks were the norm, while the poor were left to fend for themselves on whatever meager scraps they could find. In times of death, many were forced to eat famine bread, which was made from a desperate mixture of peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. Others turned to hunting or foraging for wild plants. The common people rose up to demand better treatment and a fairer share of the wealth in Peasant. Revolts like the English Uprising in 1381 or the German Bono movement in the early 16th century. Although these uprisings were frequently brutally put down, they nevertheless served as a testament to the unquenchable human spirit and the enduring dream of a world where everyone could enjoy the basic dignity of a full belly and a decent life. Moreover, the seeds of a more lively and varied food culture were being sown in the kitchens and gardens of common people. Women, who were primarily responsible for providing for their families, were the unsung heroes of medieval cuisine. Through their inventiveness and resourcefulness, they discovered ways to extract flavor and nourishment from even the most basic ingredients in the folk traditions of pickling, preserving, and foraging. They also passed down knowledge that would help their communities get through difficult times and set the groundwork for future culinary revolutions. The story of food in the Middle Ages is undoubtedly one of hardship and deprivation, but it is also one of ingenuity, resilience, and hope. In the face of oppression and scarcity, medieval people found ways to nourish not only their bodies but also their spirits. Finding joy and communion in the simple act of sharing a meal, they fostered a spirit of solidarity and resilience in the communal ovens and shared meals of village life, which would prove to be as sustaining as any loaf of bread. Their story serves as a reminder of the fundamental human right to food and the critical importance of fighting for a more just and sustainable food system. As we reflect on this distant and frequently challenging past, we can draw inspiration from their example in our own kitchens and around our own tables. We can honor their legacy by cherishing the abundance we enjoy and never forgetting to share it with those who have less, because, in the end, the true measure of a society is not in the opulence of its feasts, but rather as we've seen while peasants lived on girl and stale bread. Nobles feasted on the best the land had to offer. Imagine being the royal cook, tasked with the enormous task of preparing lavish meals for the king and his court. Your day starts before dawn as you oversee the delivery of ingredients from far and wide. For the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, food was a daily struggle of scarcity, monotony, and even danger. However, there was one place where the food was always abundant, varied, and exquisite. The king's huntsmen rode in with deer and boar slung over their saddles, ready to be turned into savory roasts and pies in the cavernous castle kitchens. A small army of servants bustled about under your command, and fires roared in the great hearths as spits turned slowly roasting. Wide wagons rolled into the castle courtyard, loaded with barrels of wine from Burgundy, wheels of cheese from the Alps, and crates of spices from the Orient. As the feast hour drew near, you added the final touches to your creations. A magnificent roast swan with its plume-owned neck curving gracefully on the platter, a gleaming aspic studded with gems of fruit, cauldrons bubbling with fragrant stews, and soups and bakers kneading dough for bread and pastries. The air was thick with the aroma of exotic spices, including cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, and cloves. When the noble guests finally filed into the great hall and took their seats, it was time for your masterpieces to be unveiled. The servants paraded the platters to the high table with a flourish, and the guests oohed and aed as they were served, marveling at the bounty before them. For a few glorious hours, they dined like gods sampling delicacies, while each dish was a work of art, crafted to delight the eye as much as the palate. While the royal feast may have stood in stark contrast to the meager rations, the spectre of illness lurked behind the splendor of the court, even in this rarefied realm. Despite all the expense and artistry, even the most sumptuous dishes could harbor deadly spillage, and the sheer excess of the feast often led to overindulgence as nobles gorged themselves far beyond the point of satisfaction. It was not unheard of for a courtier to literally eat himself to death due to his own gluttony. The medieval relationship with food was always a precarious one. Today, we can hardly imagine the hardships that our ancestors endured simply to fill their bellies. The poorest among us have access to a variety and quality of food that would have been unthinkable even for medieval kings. As a result, we can walk into a gleaming supermarket and find fruits and vegetables from every season, meats and other foods without refrigeration or food safety standards. The medieval peasant, for all his suffering, probably felt a deep connection to the land and the changing of the seasons. He knew intimately the sweat and toil that went into every mouthful. While we may feel sorry for him because of his limited options, he would likely look upon our pre-packaged mass-produced meals with a mixture of wonder and horror one can imagine. Cheeses from every continent, spices and sauces from every cuisine. Allow us to eat what we want, when we want, without fear of famine or food poisoning. But perhaps we have also lost something in our abundance. Medieval serf is transported to the snack aisle of a modern grocery store, where he marvels at the colorful bags and boxes that stretch out in front of him. He picks up a shiny packet and turns it over in his weathered hands, reading the unfamiliar word made with real cheese. He shakes his head in disbelief, thinking that it is impossible for a mere peasant to have real cheese. He puts it back on the shelf and continues on, overwhelmed by the strange bounty of this new world. As we go to sleep, let's pause to consider the luxury of choice and remember the innumerable as the sun set over the busy port city of Venice. A weary spice merchant named Luca disembarked from his ship with his valuable cargo of exotic spices from the east securely in his satchel. Luca had spent months traveling the perilous Silk Road, battling bandits, sandstorms, and intense heat to ensure that we could enjoy the luxury of a full larder. Let's be thankful for the simple everyday miracle of having enough to eat. Bring a taste of distant places to the tables of rich Europeans. For Luca and merchants like him, the spice trade was a profitable but dangerous business. The nobility used spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron to flavor their rich meals and flaunt their wealth. But for the common people, these aromatic seasonings remained an unaffordable luxury, and their meals remained sadly bland and unappetizing. As Luca made his way through Venice's winding canals to deliver his wares to his wealthy clientele, he couldn't help but think about the life of a spice merchant was one of constant movement and danger, with fortunes won and lost on the whims of the sea and the shifting sands of the desert. While nobles dined on succulent roasts flavored with exotic spices, peasants lived on little more than coarse bread and watery porridge, their palates never fully understanding the lively tang of pepper or the warm, sweet embrace of cinnamon. While he dined on saffron-infused stews and fragrant spiced wines that the common people went to, Luca couldn't help but feel that despite all the wealth and prestige the spice trade brought him, it remained a bitter reminder of the profound inequalities that plagued medieval society. He endured hardships on his journeys, attacks by renegade bandits, treacherous mountain passes, and the constant threat of disease. But he persisted, driven by the promise of riches and the excitement of the unknown as he made his final deliveries and tallied his profits. Luca went to his opulent villa for the night, knowing that tomorrow he would once again set sail for distant lands, chasing the promise of fortune and leaving behind a world where the simple pleasure of a flavorful meal remained an unattainable dream for most. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a weary housewife named Matilda woke up from her sleep, bed with growling stomachs, their dreams haunted by the alluring aromas that wafted from the elite kitchens. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, Matilda saw that she had little time to preserve the few crops her family had managed to coax from the unforgiving earth. Her mind was already racing with the innumerable tasks that lay ahead for her and countless other women throughout medieval Europe. The arrival of autumn did not herald a season of abundant harvests and joyous feasts, but rather one of ceaseless labor and knowing anxiety about the spectre of winter. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda's thoughts drifted to the extravagant feasts of the nobility, where rich meats and exotic delicacies were consumed with want and abandon. But for her and her fellow peasants, such extravagances were little more than cruel gestures, taunting reminders of the vast chasm that separated the haves from the have-nots in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. Nothing could be allowed to go to waste, lest they face the unimaginable prospect of starvation in the bleak months ahead. The work was tedious and exhausting, but Matilda couldn't afford to take a break because she knew that every morsel she preserved now could mean the difference between life and death come winter. As the days passed and the leaves started to turn, Matilda's thoughts turned to the harsh realities that lay ahead, even with all her hard work. She worked from dawn until dusk, salting and smoking what little meat they had managed to raise, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar, and hanging herbs to dry in the rafters. Even in the face of such dire circumstances, Matilda found comfort in the knowledge that her tireless efforts would at least give her family a fighting chance. With a fierce determination burning in her heart, she continued her labors, her hands raw and her spirit weary, but her resolve remained strong. Winter would be a time of scarcity and hardship, with meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel day after day. The spectre of hunger was a constant companion, lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting to sink its icy claws into the weak and the vulnerable. As the first snowflakes fell and the icy winds of winter swept across the land, Matilda could only hope that her labors had been sufficient. With a heavy heart and an empty lowered, she prepared to face the long, dark months ahead, knowing that, for her and countless others like her, the struggle for survival was only just getting started. Unshakable because in a world where famine and privation were constant threats, the simple act of preserving food was an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to submit to the unyielding cruelty of fate. A lavish feast was being held in a grand castle, surrounded by rolling hills and lush forests. The great hall was filled with the sound of goblets clinking and rocking laughter as nobles from all over the world gathered to participate in this extravagant display of wealth and power. The lord of the manor sat at the head of the table, his jeweled fingers tearing into a succulent roast swan, its delicate flesh flavored with exotic spices from far-off lands. The tables around him groped under the weight of innumerable delicacies. It was a sensory feast that contrasted sharply with the meager rations of the serfs, working in the fields outside the castle walls. For these poor peasants, the idea of such a feast was little more than a cruel fantasy, a tantalizing glimpse of a world forever beyond their reach as they huddled in their drafty H-fells, their bellies gnawing. Savory meat pies, rich stews, and decadent pastries were all testaments to the culinary prow of the castle's master chefs. Their own meals, if they could be called that, consisted of little more than a thin crust made from whatever scraps and leftovers they could scramble together. A few fortunate ones might have a meager crust of bread to gnaw on, but for the majority, even that was a rare luxury. The idea of meat, let alone the succulent delicacies, being devoured by the nobles, was little more than a distant concept. Beyond the castle walls, the serfs huddled in their misery, their stomachs cramping with hunger and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would probably never know the pleasures of a full belly or a contented heart. However, as the feast continued and the wine flowed freely, the nobles became more and more boisterous, their laughter resonating through the halls and echoing off the stone walls. They exchanged bawdy jokes and tales of their exploits, their faces flushed with the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of their overindulge. As the last remnants of the feast's great fires died out and the nobles retired to their plush chambers, the serfs returned to their own meager dwellings, their minds haunted by the tantalizing aromamus and raucous laughter that had filled the night air with heavy hearts and empty stomachs. For them, life was little more than an endless cycle of back-breaking labor and knowing hunger, with the cruel whims of fate forever conspiring to keep them in their place. In the busy streets of a medieval town, an Alu wife named Agnes hurried back and forth with jugs of her latest brew. Agnes was a stout, no-nonsense woman who had been brewing ale for as long as anyone could remember. It was a hard life, full of long hours and meager profits, but it was the only life she had ever known. She navigated the narrow alleys, avoiding the trash and feces that littered the streets, as she made her way through the winding alleys, but feel guilty about the short cut she made with her most recent batch because things were hard and grain. Prices were skyrocketing, so she had no choice but to stretch her ale with a little extra water. This was a risky move that could get her in trouble with the local authorities if anyone found out. But she had no other option because her customers, who were mostly hard-working laborers and craftsmen, relied on her ale to give them a quick break from the grind of their everyday lives. They craved the rich, hearty flavor and the satisfying rush that came with a few pints after a long day's work. But as she reached the tavern and started to unload her goods, Agnes couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that she was betraying her customers' trust because she took pride in her craft and the idea of serving them. Watered-down swill made her stomach turn. But, with the cost of ingredients eating into her already meager profits, Agnes had been forced to cut corners wherever she could. With a heavy heart, Agnes started to serve her customers while observing their faces contorting in disappointment as they eagerly quaffed down the subpar ale. Some muttered complaints to themselves, while others outright demanded to know what had happened to the usually stellar brew. Agnes did her best to divert their questions and allay their worries, but the guilt still gnawed at her. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, but in a world where existence was a daily struggle, sometimes concessions had to be made. The struggle to survive in a world of scarcity and hardship was a constant battle for Agnes and countless other alewives like her. As the night wore on and the crowd started to thin, Agnes finally gave herself a moment to breathe. She looked at the empty jugs and the meager pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harsh realities of her trade. With a weary sigh, she started to clean up her mind, which was already racing with worries about how she would make ends meet in the days ahead. In the grand halls of a medieval palace, a royal cook named Gome scoured the kitchen, his brow furrowed, in concentration as he oversaw the preparations for the evening's lavish feast. Gome was a master of his craft, renowned throughout the country for his ability to create culinary masterpieces that dazzled the senses and brought them the taste of a better life. Despite the fact that the line between right and wrong was often blurred in the face of desperation, they persisted, motivated by the hope that one day their sacrifice and hard work would pay off, and they would finally experience the taste of a better life. Gome couldn't help but feel proud of the luxury and extravagance that surrounded him as he went from station to station, barking orders and sampling sauces. The kitchen was bustling with scully maids and kitchen boys running back and forth with the best ingredients from all over the realm. There were succulent roasts and plump capons, their skins glistening with honey and spices, mountains of fresh fruits. And even as he reveled in his role as the mastermind behind it all, Gome couldn't shake the uneasiness that gnawed at the back of his mind because he knew all too well the stark contrast between the lavish feasts he prepared for the nobility and the meager scraps that passed for meals among the common folk. The vegetables, their colors so vibrant they seemed to leap off the platters, and the delicate pastries and confections, each one a work of art in its own right, deeply disturbed him, even though he knew that criticizing it would mean jeopardizing everything he had worked so hard to accomplish. As the last preparations were completed and the first course was served, Gome observed from the shadows as the nobles sat down, their faces glowing with anticipation. He saw how their eyes widened in delight as they tasted his creations, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to enjoy the satisfaction of a job well done. But as the night went on and the revelry became more boisterous, Gome couldn't get rid of the growing uneasiness that pulled at his heart. He thought about the innumerable hungry mouths outside the palace walls, the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of people who had never experienced the joy of a full belly. As the last of the dishes were cleared away and the nobles retired to their chambers, their stomachs groaning with the excesses of the feast, Gome finally gave himself a moment's rest, slumping against the kitchen wall with his eyes closed and his heart heavy with the weight of the injustices he had committed. even though he knew that such a world was only a dream, a fantasy as far away and unachievable as the stars themselves. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in a world where food was a basic right granted to everyone, rather than a privilege reserved for a select few. Until then, Gome knew that he would continue to practice his trade, his hands permanently stained with the guilt of the plenty he created and the poverty he has. We have explored the harsh realities and cruel inequities that define the era's food culture throughout the annals of medieval history. It is impossible to avoid feeling grateful for the relative abundance and variety that we enjoy in the modern age. The struggles and hardships faced by our ancestors, from the lowest serf to the most skilled artisan, serve as a poignant reminder of just how far we have come in terms of food production. As we consider the lessons learned from the past and the difficulties of the present, it is crucial to keep in mind that, despite our efforts to guarantee that everyone has access to the necessities of life, the threat of hunger and malnutrition still exists in many parts of the world. Even in the midst of plenty, there are still people who go to bed with empty stomachs and aching hearts, their dreams haunted by the same cruel inequalities that plagued the medieval world. Even in the face of such overwhelming odds, we must never lose sight of the progress we have made and the hope that keeps us going. We must draw strength from the bravery and tenacity of those who came before us, those who toiled in the fields and fought for food justice. It is evident that the fight for food justice is far from over, and will require the combined efforts of all those who believe in the fundamental human right to nourishment and sustenance. It is a vision that may seem far away and unachievable, a dream as brittle and transient as the wisps of steam rising from a bowl of girl. But it is a dream worth fighting for, a dream that has the power to change the world and give hope to everyone who is hungry for a better world. They worked in the kitchens, their hands calloused and their hearts heavy with the weight of their burdens. And we must keep moving forward to fight for a world where no one goes hungry and where the bounty of the earth is shared equally among all those who call it home. Tomorrow, so let us set out with a fresh sense of purpose and resolve, equipped with the wisdom of the past and the hope of the future, and work to create a world where the abundance of the palace kitchens finds its way into the bellies of the poor, and where everyone who has worked to make it happen can share in the harvest's joys. After all, the fight for food justice is about more than just satisfying hunger and filling stomachs. It's about the very essence of what it means to be human, about the ties of compassion, and we cannot afford to lose the empathy that unites us all across time and space. Therefore, let's move forward with open hearts and willing hands, prepared to contribute to the enormous task of creating a world where everyone can experience the simple joy of a full belly and a contented smile. Because in that world, the legacy of the medieval food culture will not be one of scarcity and deprivation, but one of abundance and hope, a testament to the peasants who worked in the fields from dawn to dusk. Such luxury was unthinkable. Their bellies were never fully satisfied by the meager meals they ate, which might have consisted of a chunk of dense coarse bread and a thin barley or rye porridge called pottage. If they were lucky, they might also have a small scrap of hard cheese or a few shriveled peas to add some flavor. The lack of variety in the peasant diet was striking, as the nobility dined on delicacies from far-off lands, while the common people had to settle for the same bland staples day after day. The only thing that broke the monotony was the changing of the seasons, which determined what meager produce might be available in the spring. Tender greens like nettles or dandelions might provide a welcome respite from the usual diet. Sustenance meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a bit of tough, stringy salted pork on a special occasion like Christmas or Easter. As summer arrived, a few priceless fruits, such as small hard apples or bitter crab apples, could be picked from the forest. Harvest season arrived in the fall, which meant back-breaking work, but also a brief supply of fresh grains and maybe a few killed hogs to preserve. Salt meat for the long winter ahead. Winter was the leanest and most dreaded season for medieval peasants, with short days and chilly nights that left families huddled around smoky hearths with pinched bellies. It's difficult for us to imagine such a precarious existence where a single failed crop could spell doom for an entire village. But for the majority of people in the Middle Ages, this was the grim reality of daily life. They lived at the mercy of the elements, the nobility, and the food that was left over from the harvest had to be carefully hoarded and distributed in small portions to last until spring. This was the time of year when the pottage grew thinner and more watery, the bread even harder and more tooth-breaking. Even those slightly higher up the social scale, such as skilled craftsmen or prosperous freemen, rarely enjoyed much better than their poorer neighbors. A bowl of pottage might be enriched with a bit of precious butter or a scrap of meat, but the fundamental monotony remained the same. This is also true for the monks in their abbeys and monasteries, who generally ate better than the laity, subsisting on bread, cheese, fish, and ale. The frequently cruel whims of fate made feeding a mouth was both a burden and a blessing, leaving another empty belly to fill from limited resources. Still relatively austere by today's standards, ale was the popular beverage of the Middle Ages, consumed by both young and old. Clean drinking water was frequently in short supply, and the fermentation process offered some protection against waterborne illnesses. But even this minor comfort could be tainted by dishonest brewers stretching their product with unsavory ingredients. Since food was a daily struggle and a never-ending cycle of toil and hunger for everyone but a privileged few, dishonest bakers might do the same with bread, mixing the precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, or even sawdust and chalk. These deceptions were officially frowned upon and could be severely punished if discovered, but the desperate realities of the time made them all too common. The nobles in their grand halls, dining on elaborately prepared dishes and fine wines, seemed to inhabit a completely different plane of existence than the peasant's lot was to suffer and endure in order to eke out a meager living from an unforgiving land and hope for a better life in the hereafter. Despite this, there were small moments of rest and celebration during the holidays. The stark division between the grimy, half-starved peasants working their lands often led to resentment and occasionally open rebellion, but more often it produced a sort of grim resignation and acceptance that this was just the way things were. These fleeting moments of convenience made the difficult times easier to bear and served as a reminder that even in the face of extreme adversity, the human spirit could persevere. These hard-bitten medieval people carried their burdens with a stoicism and tenacity that is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. Feast days offered brief glimpses of plenty when even the poorest might enjoy a bit of meat or a sweet pastry. Weddings, christenings, and other milestones were marked with communal meals. In a society where hunger was the norm, stories of tables, groaning under the weight of succulent meats, fresh fruits, and sweet delicacies offered a tantalizing escape from reality. Myths and legends frequently featured magical cauldrons that never ran empty or enchanted lands where no one ever went hungry. Perhaps this is why stories of great feasts and fantastical foods held such appeal in medieval popular culture. They did so with grim determination, knowing that survival depended on their own hard work and cunning in a world where starvation was always lurking around every corner. Even in prosperous times, the common people's diet was woefully inadequate by modern nutritional standards, heavy on grains and light on pretty much everything else. This left a large portion of the population malnourished and susceptible to disease. While the medieval peasant may have dreamed of such wonders, their everyday reality remained one of unrelenting hardship, with the spectre of famine always present and ready to descend at the first sign of blight or drought. Far-reaching effects on medieval society, including stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and increased the risk of childbirth. It also depleted strength and vitality, leaving peasants ill-prepared to handle the back-breaking labor that was their lot in life. Nevertheless, life continued as usual, with crops being planted, harvests being made, babies being born, raised, and the great wheel being turned. The medieval peasantry may not have had many material comforts, but they relied on their faith, family, and community to keep them afloat. They found happiness in the small things, like a hot fire on a chilly night or a full stomach after a harvest feast. And they persevered through season after harsh season with a fortitude and tenacity that is difficult not to admire. The next time you eat, take a moment to appreciate the amazing variety and abundance at your fingertips, and remember your wild medieval peasant may have dreamed of a magical land of endless feasts. We are fortunate enough to live in a world where that dream is tantalizingly close to reality, which is a privilege we should never take for granted. The plight of the medieval peasant was further compounded by the unbalanced nature of their diets. Therefore, we should be grateful for the centuries of progress and plenty that separate us from those grim, hungry times. A typical peasant family might consider themselves lucky to have a cow, a pig, or a small flock of chickens. But the milk, eggs, and meat these animals provided were a rare treat reserved for special occasions or times of dire need, while the nobility feasted on a cornucopia of meats, fruits, and vegetables. The average serf subsisted on a mega fare dominated by grains, porridge, and coarse bread, supplemented by whatever small morsels they could eke out from their labors. Usually, any surplus was sold or paid as rent, too, in the great hall of the castle. The tables are laden with roasted meats, savory pies, exotic fruits, and fine cheeses. The air is filled with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves as richly. Dressed lords and ladies dine with gusto, while in the small H-vel of a peasant family, there is a pot of thin bubbles. Imagine, if you will, the stark contrast between a noble's lavish feast and a serf's humble meal. The unbalanced nature of the peasant diet had a severe negative impact on the children's health. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening the immune system and leaving the population susceptible to disease. Scurvy, which is caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common affliction that led to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death. Over the fire, the mother carefully portions out the meager serving, making sure each member of the family receives just enough to stave off the gnawing hunger in their bellies. Untreated famine, also known as seasons of dirt, made matters worse. Crop failures brought on by drought, flooding, or pests could spell disaster for entire regions, leaving peasant families to starve and die of disease and hunger. One particularly horrific story comes from the chronicler Henry of Livonia, who wrote about a famine in the early 13th century, in which the peasants were so desperate that they began eating dogs, cats, and even rats, Although such drastic measures were uncommon, the corpses of the dead serve as a somber reminder of the precariousness of life for the peasantry of medieval society. The The rigid class hierarchy of the time was reflected in the unequal distribution of food in medieval society, where the nobility enjoyed a varied and plentiful diet, while the vast majority of the population lived on the verge of starvation, their meals being a monotonous and meager affair. This disparity would persist for centuries, with only gradual in a time before stringent regulations and quality control. Dishonest producers and merchants frequently turned to taking shortcuts and misleading their customers in the name of profit. One common target for adulteration was bread, a staple of the medieval diet, as bakers looking to stretch their budget. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we turn our attention to another scourge that plagued the populace: adulterated food and drink. Improvements in agricultural techniques and social reforms were gradually closing the gap. Their meager supplies of flour would be combined with a variety of unsavory additives, such as ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, and even ground bones, to bulk up the loaves. This resulted in bread that was frequently dense, gritty, and devoid of flavor and nutrition. Additionally, wine and beer, the popular beverages of the time, were tampered with. In an era when clean drinking water was frequently scarce, these fermented beverages were thought to be a safer alternative. But dishonest brewers and vintners would frequently dilute their products to boost their profits. Producing weak, the story of Agnes, the Alou wife, exemplifies the temptation to adulterate one's goods. Agnes was a widow who was struggling to support herself and her children with the meager profits from her small brewing operation. One particularly hard year, when grain prices were skyrocketing and her clientele was dwindling, Agnes made the disastrous decision to water down her ale, stretching her limited supply in order to sell more volume. At first, her deception went unnoticed. While medieval authorities did attempt to regulate the quality of food and drink, enforcement was frequently loose and inconsistent. The Assay of Bread and Ale, a 13th century English law, set strict standards, caused Agnes to close her business, leaving her family to face an uncertain future. Agnes sighed with relief as the coins clinked into her purse. But word quickly spread of the weak, tasteless brew, and her once loyal customers started to seek out other alehouses. The prevalence of contaminated food and drink in medieval society added yet another layer of misery to the already difficult lives of the common people. Not only were their diets boring and nutritionally inadequate, but they also had to deal with the constant threat of being defrauded or sickened by dishonest producers. Although bakers and brewers found inventive ways to get around the rules, the penalties of fines and public humiliation were common punishments for those caught adulterating their products. In a world where food was literally a matter of life or death, the medieval peasant had little choice but to make do. This serves as a reminder of the masses' helplessness in the face of a system that was stacked against them. As we dig deeper into the realities of medieval food, it clears that the romantic image of a bountiful rustic past is far from the truth. For the vast majority of the population, eating was a daily struggle fraught with scarcity, monotony, and the constant threat of adulteration. The difficulties of medieval dining extended beyond the quantity and quality of the food itself. The very setting in which people ate was frequently a cause of discomfort and even danger. In our upcoming chapter, we will examine the unhygienic conditions that afflicted the medieval world and how they contributed to the general misery of the era's culinary landscape. Imagine a typical medieval peasant home, where the small, claustrophobic space is shared not only with the air is heavy with the strong smell of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and wood smoke. In such close quarters, the boundary between living space and barnyard was frequently blurred. Livestock were kept indoors not only for their own safety but also for the warmth they provided during the cold winter months. By the human occupants, as well as a menagerie of livestock. Chickens peck at the dirt floor, while a pig roots in the corner looking for any stray scraps of food. The peasant's primary source of sustenance was frequently contaminated by the unhygienic conditions in which it was prepared and consumed. The result of this lack of hygiene was severe digestive disorders, parasitic infections, and food poisoning, which were frequent occurrences that sapped the strength and vitality of the population. The high cost of sanitation and hygiene was caused by animal waste and the general lack of cleanliness, which created a breeding ground for disease flies that buzzed constantly, spreading filth and contamination from one surface to another, as demonstrated by the story of King John of England, who was on the move in 1216 fighting against rebel barons who wanted to curtail his power. Even the highest echelons of society were susceptible to the dangers of contaminated food. While, in the town of Lynn, King John enjoyed a feast of peaches, which was unusual for the time, but he was unaware that the peaches had been improperly stored and had started to rot. Driven by hunger and a love of exotic fruits, John ate his fill, only to become seriously ill shortly after, plagued by descent and fever. The king's health quickly declined, but he continued his campaign despite being exposed to the elements while traversing the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash. John's baggage train was lost to the rising waters, taking his crown jewels and other valuables with it. The king barely survived, but his days were numbered less than 2 weeks later when he passed away from his illness, ending his reign with a simple King John's fate, though perhaps more dramatic than most, was not unusual. In a world where food safety was a rare luxury, the medieval landscape was a veritable minefield of potential hazards. From contaminated water sources to spoiled meat, and even the air itself could be dangerous because the miasma theory of disease was prevalent, which held that the main causes of illness spread were bad air and foul odor. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and industrial pollution combined to create a miasmatic brew that was thought to be the cause of a variety of illnesses. However, in reality, it was the unsanitary conditions themselves that allowed disease to flourish. For example, the Black Death, which killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, was spread by fleas infected with the disease rather than by poor air. The impact of unsanitary conditions on medieval food culture cannot be overstated. It was not just a matter of unpleasant odor and sporadic episodes of illness, but a pervasive and deadly threat that loomed over every meal, the simple act of eating which we today take for granted as a pleasurable activity. Bacillus yearnia, pestis, thrived in the crowded, filthy conditions of medieval cities, creating an ideal environment for the disease to take hold and spread like wildfire. In a world where even the most basic standards of hygiene were frequently lacking, food became not only a source of sustenance, but also a potential vector for disease and suffering. This, along with the lack of food and the monotony of the peasant diet, created a culinary landscape that was as depressing as it was unappetizing. As we continue our investigation into why food in medieval times was so bad, we find that it's crucial to keep in mind that the difficulties we've covered thus far, such as the lack of variety, the difficulty of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unhygienic conditions, were not the only ones at work. In our upcoming chapter, we'll focus on how the church influenced the gastronomic practices of the era, and how religious doctrine frequently made the already significant struggles faced by the typical medieval diner even worse. But first, let's pause to consider the amazing adaptability and resilience of our ancestors. As we eat our own food, let's remember the medieval peasant, whose daily struggle for survival was a testament to the indomitable human spirit in a society where the Catholic Church held immense power and influence. The peasants' struggles were made worse by the rigid religious doctrines of the Church. Despite unthinkable adversity, they managed to survive and even flourish, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape our world today. Every element of life was impacted by its teachings and decrees, including the most fundamental human need, food. The foundation of the Church's dietary regulations were the ideas of fasting and abstinence on specific days of the year, especially during Lent, when the faithful were expected to refrain from eating meat and to restrict their total food intake. For the already malnourished peasantry, these regulations could be especially onerous. Just consider the predicament of a poor peasant family during this time. The story of John and Matilda, a fictional but all too real peasant couple, illustrates the struggles faced by many during this time. They were already subsisting on a meager diet of bread and gruel, and now they were expected to forego even the occasional scrap of salted pork or dried fish that gave their meals a modicum of flavor and sustenance. The growl of empty stomachs became a constant companion as they struggled to maintain their piety in the face of knowing hunger. The children were too young to comprehend the reasons for their deprivation, so they cried uncontrollably from hunger. John, a devout man, struggled to maintain his faith in the face of such hardship, while Matilda secretly dreamed of the savory stew she would make when Lent arrived. During the best of times, they and their 3 children dutifully put away their meager stores of preserved meat and resigned themselves to a diet of thin GRL and boiled turnips. The couple's predicament was not unique to the land. Peasant families also struggle with their already limited diets, which are further restricted by church regulations. Some desperate individuals took to poaching in the royal forests, risking harsh punishment if caught, while others just went without, their bodies deteriorating and their spirits collapsing under the weight of their devotion. The Church's dietary restrictions were ostensibly noble, encouraging spiritual reflection, and even in the midst of such hardship, there were glimmers of hope and compassion. Monasteries and abbeys, with their vast landholdings and well-towed ladders, frequently served as a source of food aid for the poor monks and nuns bound by their vows of charity and hospitality. However, penance's impact on the peasantry was often dire in a society already plagued by scarcity and inequality. The added burden of religious fasting could be the difference between life and death. Distribute bread and ale to the hungry, giving them a temporary reprieve from the agony of an empty stomach. One such tale describes a generous abbot named Hildegard, who, upon observing the thin faces of the peasants who came to her abbey in search of weapons, instructed her kitchens to prepare a substantial pottage of vegetables and barley to be given to everyone who asked. The grateful recipients' spirits were raised by this unanticipated act of kindness, and they returned home with newfound strength and a glimmer of hope. As we consider how religion shaped medieval Europe's culinary landscape, it is crucial to acknowledge the intricate relationship between faith, power, and social inequality that characterized the time period. For the peasantry, food was not only a matter of sustenance, but also a daily reminder of their place in a world where even the Church, with its teachings of love and charity, was frequently complicit in maintaining the strict social hierarchy that kept them in a state of perpetual poverty and hunger. In our final chapter, We will examine the idea of the medieval feast and how it stood in stark contrast to the everyday struggles of the common people. Through this extravagant demonstration of wealth and abundance, we will learn about the extent of the inequality that characterized the time period and how food functioned as a symbol of social division as well as a source of nourishment. However, let's take a moment to put ourselves in the shoes of the medieval peasant, whose hunger was a constant. As we have seen, the life of a medieval peasant was one of constant hardship and deprivation, with food being a daily struggle rather than a source of pleasure or comfort. However, in stark contrast to this bleak reality, there existed another world, that of the royal feast in the great halls of the church. Through their struggles and their resilience, we may find a deeper appreciation for the abundance and choice that we so often take for granted in our own lives. Imagine, if you will, the scene of a grand medieval feast, where the great hall is lit by the flickering light of countless candles, their warm glow illuminating the rich tapestries and gleaming silver that adorn the walls, and the tables are laden with a vast array of dishes, each more sumptuous than the lavish banquets that the nobility would gather to partake in. These feasts were not just a display of wealth and power, but also a symbol of the vast chasm that existed between the ruling class and the masses. There are platters of roasted fowl with their succulent flesh stuffed with exotic spices and herbs, pies filled with tender game with flaky crusts concealing a treasure trove of savory delights, and fruits and vegetables of every hue, their vibrant colors a testament to the bounty of the land presiding over the table. Finally, at the center of the table sits a magnificent roasted boar, its crisp golden skin glistening with fat. In the dimly lit, narrow streets of a medieval town, a baker named Alric wiped the perspiration from his brow as he worked over his latest batch of bread. The harvest had been poor this year, and grain prices were skyrocketing, so Alric had to covertly stretch his dough with fillers like ground acorns, sawdust, and other ingredients to make ends meet. This lavish display is the royal cook, a master of his craft who has spent days preparing for this great occasion. In a world where clean drinking water was often scarce, Ulrich's thoughts drifted to the alewife down the street, who was known for watering down her brew to make it last longer. Even chalk was a common practice among dishonest bakers looking to maximize their profits, even if it meant compromising the quality and safety of their bread. However, this also meant that the quality of these drinks was often questionable at best in larger cities, where the authorities did make an effort to regulate the food and drink industry to some degree. For example, bakers who were caught adulterating their bread could be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with their subpar loaves hung round their necks. However, these laws were frequently poorly enforced, and the penalties were not always a strong enough deterrent. Many bakers and brewers simply saw the fines as a cost of doing business and continued to cut corners wherever they could for the average person. It was just another hardship in a life already full of obstacles and uncertainties. As Alric took his most recent batch of bread out of the oven, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt, because he knew that his customers trusted him to provide them with honest, wholesome food. But in a world where survival often comes first, the food and drink they consumed were often of questionable quality. Bread that was supposed to nourish them might instead be filled with inedible or even harmful substances, and a ley that was so watered down that it provided little refreshment. After a long day of hunting, King John of England sat down to a lavish meal, as was customary. He was presented with a variety of dishes, including fruit, meat, and sweetmeats. But he had little choice but to cut corners and bend the rules in the hopes that his small deceptions would go unnoticed, and that his bread would provide some small comfort to those who ate it, even if it wasn't quite what it seemed. Part 5. Unsanitary conditions. Although historians disagree as to the precise cause of King John's death, his story highlights the harsh reality of medieval life. Unsanitary conditions were common and had a significant negative impact on people's health and well-being. In many medieval households, livestock were frequently kept indoors for warmth and safety. The peaches John ate that day were spoiled, most likely as a result of improper handling and storage. And shortly after the meal, John became violently ill, with dysentery, a disease that would ultimately claim his life. The situation was even worse in medieval cities, where garbage and human waste were frequently simply dumped into the streets or nearby rivers, without any understanding of germ theory or the importance of hygiene. People lived in close proximity to filth and squalor, creating the perfect breeding ground for disease. The result of these unsanitary conditions was severe death, such as that which killed King John, and it also meant that homes were constantly contaminated with animal waste and vermin. Fleas, lice, and rats were common companions, spreading disease and making life miserable for the human occupants of the home. The story of King Jay's death was noteworthy because of his position, but it was not unique for the rich and poor. In a world without antibiotics or modern medical knowledge, even a minor infection could quickly become life-threatening. Other diseases like cholera, typhoid fever, and even the dreaded Black Death also flourished in the filthy conditions of medieval cities. For the average person, there was little escape from the constant threat of illness. As the sun set over the medieval city, the stench of waste and decay hung heavy in the distance, and the bells of the church told a somber reminder of the many lives claimed by the filth and squalor of the streets. For the city's residents, it was just another day in a life where disease and death were a constant presence, fueled in large part by the unsanitary conditions in which they lived. This grim reality of medieval life would last for centuries until the advent of modern sanitation and hygiene practices. In a world where disease was a constant companion and cleanliness was a luxury, a peasant family gathered around their meager evening meal in a small cottage on the outskirts of a medieval village. The meal was simple, consisting of a hard crust of bread and a thin pottage made from vegetables and a scrap of salted pork. It was Lent, and the family was trying their best to follow the church's directive to fast and refrain from eating meat. During this holy season, for the peasants, the Lenten fast was an especially challenging task because their diets were already severely restricted by the church had a significant and far-reaching influence on medieval cuisine. In addition to the Lenten fast, the church also mandated meatless days throughout the year, usually Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. For the wealthy, these restrictions were an inconvenience, but for the poor, they could mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. Their poverty and the lack of food meant that they had to survive on an even more meager and monotonous diet than usual. As a form of charity, monks and nuns would give bread, ale, and occasionally even meat to the poor, especially on holy days and festivals. However, the church's dietary regulations did not always alleviate the suffering of the peasantry. During periods of extreme scarcity, some peasants turned to poaching game from the royal forests, risking severe punishment if caught. The church, working with secular authorities, strictly enforced these hunting bans, viewing poaching as a sin. The peasant family knew that the fast would not last forever, and that Easter would provide a brief respite from the monotony and scarcity of their diet. But they also knew that the church's influence on their daily lives would continue long after Lent had ended. The cycle of fasting and feasting, of scarcity and abundance, was woven into the very fabric of medieval life, shaping not only what people ate, but also how they lived and worshipped in the grand cathedrals and modest parish churches. As they finished their meager Lenten meal, they bowed their heads in prayer, thanking God for what little they had. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink. Even when food was available, there was no guarantee that it would be wholesome or pure. In a world without industry regulations or safety standards, deception and corner cutting were commonplace. The peasants lived their lives in the shadow of the church, their stomachs growling with hunger as they prayed for a better world to come. The priests preached the virtues of fasting and self-denial, but for them, these virtues were a necessity rather than a choice. Although dishonest brewers and vendors were notorious for watering down their wares to maximize profits, bakers were not the only ones who were guilty of this. In a time when clean drinking water was often scarce, people relied on ale and wine to quench their thirst. A baker trying to make a living by selling his bread to the town's residents might resort to mixing in fillers like ground acorns, sawdust, or even chalk. While these additives may have bulked up the loaves, they certainly didn't make for a nutritious or appetizing meal. Imagine an alewife in a busy town with thirsty customers clamoring for a pint. She ladles out the weak, watery brew with a guilty conscience, knowing that she's cheating her customers. But she has no choice, because the taxes are high, the grain is expensive, and she needs to make ends meet somehow. She silently thanks the heavens that the majority of her clients are already too inebriated to notice the deception. This shows that greed wasn't the only thing driving these. The size of bread and ale in the 13th century established severe penalties for bakers and brewers caught defrauding their customers. However, in a society where people were unable to afford to be picky, many would gladly accept a loaf of bread filled with sawdust over no bread at all. When crops failed and famine struck, people resorted to eating anything they could get their hands on just to survive, including grass, roots, and tree bark. The next time you bite into a fresh, crusty baguette or sip a cool, crisp lager, remember how far we've come in our world of abundant food choices and strict quality control. In the medieval world, food fraud was rampant, and those who dared to tamper with the purity of the staples faced fines, public humiliation, and even corporal punishment. However, due to the lack of enforcement and the ongoing pressure of scarcity, these laws did little to stop the tide of food fraud. To forget that in a world without germ theory or modern sanitation, people in the Middle Ages had to deal with the constant threat of disease. In addition to the difficulties of scarcity, spoiling, and adulteration, meals and water were frequently contaminated with harmful pathogens, and every morsel was a gamble for our medieval ancestors, and a full belly was never a guarantee. Their daily sustenance was frequently the result of deceit and desperation as much as it was of nourishment and pleasure. The very living conditions of the medieval people conspired against any notions of food safety. Many peasants shared their modest cottages with their livestock, such as cattle and chickens, living under the same roof as the family. While this arrangement gave the animals some warmth and security, it also meant that animal waste and insects were constantly present in the home, contaminating food, water, and surfaces. Cities were even worse, with their congested tenements and narrow, dirty streets. It's no wonder that medieval people had such short lifespans, because disease killed both young and old, and even the nobility wasn't immune despite their superior living conditions. Human waste and animal carcasses piled up in the gutters tainted the air and leaked into the water supply. The stench alone would have been overwhelming, but the real danger was the millions of microbes swarming on every surface. The Black Death, the greatest scourge of the medieval world, was partly made possible by the filthy conditions in which people lived. The plague was spread by rats and fleas, which flourished in the medieval squalor. The story of England serves as a warning. In 1216, while on a military campaign, the king gorged himself on peaches and cider, only to become violently ill and die a few days later. At the time, chroniclers attributed his death to gluttony, but contemporary historians believe that the true cause was food poisoning from contaminated fruit. It's a sad picture, but it's important to remember that medieval people weren't ignorant or unconcerned about cleanliness. They may not have understood the science behind disease transmission, but they recognized the importance of keeping food and water clean. And monasteries and hospitals frequently had strict hygiene rules, and medieval housewives took great pride in maintaining clean cities and towns with waste and garbage piling up and hygiene standards practically non-existent. Their homes as pristine as possible, but in a world without refrigeration, adequate sewage systems, or clean running water, there was only so much that could be done. Every day was a struggle against the forces of contamination and decay, and too frequently those forces prevailed. Therefore, the next time you eat in a modern, clean kitchen, remember your medieval ancestors who faced the obstacles head-on every day of their lives. Part 6. The influence of the Catholic Church dominated every part of life in the Middle Ages, and the faithful were no exception when it came to food. The religious calendar determined what they could eat, and to make matters more complicated, the Church imposed stringent abstinence and fasting laws, especially during the 40 days leading up to Easter. Meat, dairy products, eggs, and even olive oil was strictly forbidden. Imagine the hardship of a peasant family already on the verge of starvation, faced with the prospect of giving up what little meat and dairy they had for the sake of spiritual purity. They told them that the promise of eternal salvation was worth the small price they paid. But that was cold comfort for a mother watching her children grow thin and listless from hunger. In some places, fish was occasionally allowed, but for many poor peasants, even that was a luxury they could ill afford. Felt in the weekly menu's rhythms, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were set aside as lean days when meat was prohibited. For the wealthy, this meant simply switching to fish or other luxury foods. But for the poor, it meant foregoing all animal protein. There were a few minor exceptions, but as part of their charitable work, monasteries and abbeys would give food, aid to the hungry. They would give them bread, soup, and ale, providing a rare respite from the never-ending hunger. Companion to many, and some even welcomed guests by offering a hot supper and a place to stay for the night to those who couldn't afford an inn. But even still, there were restrictions because the church also owned a significant amount of land, dominating enormous tracts of woodland and agricultural territory. Peasants who dared to people that poached game from these areas to support their family suffered harsh penalties, including as fines, lashing, and even banishment. Many people found it ironic that a purportedly altruistic organization hoarded its wealth while its flock was hungry. It is impossible to overestimate the effect that the Church's food regulations had on the people of the Middle Ages. Religious abstinence and fasting could be an additional strain for those who are already having trouble finding enough food. Be the terror of eternal damnation and the difference between life and death was a strong force that inspired individuals to persevere through the most trying hardships for the sake of their eternal souls, which we might reflect on now. practices as primitive and even barbaric, yet to those in the Middle Ages, they were an essential component of life's fabric. The Church's influence on people's hearts and its directives carried the weight of the unquestioning thoughts of the devout. Violating divine law meant facing not only earthly retribution, but also the flames of with clenched jaws and rumbling stomachs. The people who fought during the Middle Ages did so with the assurance that their pain would be compensated in the afterlife. Thus we conclude our exploration into the gloomy depths of medieval cooking. Human tenacity is demonstrated by the fact that people are able to endure and even flourish sometimes on such a limited and unstable food source. The lack of availability, the spoiling, and the monotony of GRL and gruel once again enough to let one appreciate the basic joys of a spicy curry or a crisp apple. Can you imagine the look of surprise on a medieval peasant's face if they were taken to a contemporary, the rainbow of fresh fruits and vegetables, the shiny aisles of the supermarket, and more food than a king's banquet hall, the aromatic bread loaves and veggies in the produce department would have seemed like heavenly food to a hungry person. Waves, as well as the sheer quantity of food available to sustain a hamlet beneath, of course. There are still issues with our contemporary food system. Environmental degradation, waste, and inequality are all problems that we must contend with. But we have also achieved amazing progress since the days of we now have a better knowledge of food, safety, and nutrition thanks to turnip pies and rotten meat pies. Significance of balance and diversity in our meals, which we can maintain and deliver food over long distances so that we can taste delicacies from throughout the globe in our own kitchens. So the next time you eat, take a moment to enjoy the dish and the intricate way the flavors interact, freshness of the components, preparation technique, and consideration for our medieval forebears who, in the midst of such famine and adversity, suffered greatly. And with that we come, I hope that our peaceful time capsule of medieval cuisine has given you some fascinating background to your comprehension of the past, and perhaps have even soothed you into a sound sleep. If you liked this video, please think about liking it and following the channel to see more sad history material. Until the next time, lovely dreams.